Thank you for being with us. I know some of our senator colleagues have other meetings. There's a HR meeting of the Internal Economy Group, and I know there's some meetings with a couple of ministers going on at this moment, but I know staff and senators are here with us, so let's proceed. I'd first like to acknowledge the Algonquin Nation, on whose traditional and beautiful unceded territory we are hosting this session today. Yes, I am not yet in Mi'kma'ki, but hopefully I will go home after the Senate sittings next week. I apologize sincèrement to all participating in today's session that simultaneous interpretation is still unfortunately not available. The session will be in English only. As a reminder, when you're not speaking, please mute your microphones and turn off your cameras. I'll try to remember to do the same myself. When you're called upon to speak, please turn both your microphone and your camera back on. Today's session will be recorded and posted on social media after the session. Many have asked for it, so I'm glad that our guests have agreed to that. If you have a question, you can indicate that you would like to ask a question by typing "I have a question" in the chat box. So please just let us know if you want to have a question. Senators' questions will be considered first, and hopefully if we have time, staff can weigh in as well with their questions. The purpose of this session, as you know from my communication with you, is to continue the discussions we began with the Senate inquiry on pathways to meeting Canada's net zero emissions target that was launched in February. Think back to February. COVID was with us at that time, but we still had no idea how serious it would become. Nonetheless, we felt it was important to turn our attention back to the opportunity that Canada still has to be a climate change leader as we emerge from this global pandemic. Our session today will focus primarily on the proposal to create a new Canadian Climate Accountability Act. A report on this topic was recently launched by Climate Action Network Canada, Eco-Justice, Environmental Defence, Équiterre, West Coast Environmental Law, and the Pembina Institute. Our panelists today are Tony Mas, the Director of Legislative Affairs for Eco-Justice, Catherine Abreu, Executive Director for Climate Action Network Canada, and Julia Kroom, a staff lawyer for Eco-Justice. I won't go into their backgrounds as we've circulated their very impressive CVs. These are highly experienced and knowledgeable experts in the field, so I think you know who they are. Without further ado, I would like to invite Tony to start our session off today. Thanks, Tony. Over to you.
Great. Thanks. And good morning, everyone. I'm going to start by saying thanks to all of you, all senators and staff, for the opportunity to discuss our work on climate law and policy with you this morning. And of course, a special thanks to Senator Coyle and her team for coordinating this session in these pretty unique and challenging times. As Senator Coyle said, my name is Tony Mas. I am the Director of Legislative Affairs with Eco-Justice. We are Canada's largest public interest environmental law charity, and our work is focused on using and strengthening law and policy to protect nature, combat climate change, and ensure healthy communities. I am participating today from my home in Kitchener, Ontario, which is on the traditional lands of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and Neutral people. Kat and I are really going to carry the presentation today, but before I pass things over to them, I wanted to provide just a little bit of context around the work that we're going to be speaking to. The idea of a Canadian legal framework for climate accountability has been the focus of our organizations for some time. So when the current government was elected, at least in part, on a mandate to increase Canada's ambition on climate action, we took that as an opportunity to propose the framework that we're presenting to you here today. As I would guess you are all aware, the mandate letter issued to the Minister of Environment and Climate Change states that he is to develop plans to exceed Canada's 2030 goal under the Paris Agreement and to set Canada on a path to net zero emissions by 2050, and that he is to do so by setting legally binding 5-year emissions reduction milestones that are based on the advice of experts and consultations with Canadians. So I think it's important just to recognize from the front end that In many ways, the work that we're presenting is responding to, or at least set within the context of the minister's mandate. And importantly, to recognize that those mandate commitments are actually key ingredients of robust climate accountability frameworks. And finally, I think it's also important to note that private members' bills proposing climate accountability legislation have been introduced to the House of Commons as far back as 2007, with the latest tabled in February of this year by MP Christina Michaud. So again, just providing a little bit of context before we jump into the meat of the presentation, if you will. And to do that, I'm going to now pass things over to Kat.
Great. Thanks, Tony. Hi, everyone. I am turning my camera on to briefly say hello. I'm Catherine Abreu, Executive Director of Climate Action Network Canada, calling in today from unceded Algonquin Anishinaabe territories in Ottawa, although I too am longing for Mi'kma'ki, Senator Coyle, so hoping we both get out there sometime soon. I am going to start our presentation. I'll take us through the first few slides, and then I'll be handing it over to Julia at EcoJustice to finish us off, and then we'll open up for questions. Alrighty, here we go. So just checking that everyone can see this all right.
Looks great, thank you.
Awesome. So, as Senator Coyle said, this is some work being done by a coalition of organizations, most of which are Climate Action Network Canada members. EcoJustice is not currently a member, but a very, very close working ally. So here we are, everyone. We know from the landmark report issued by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, in 2018, that to avoid the most disastrous outcomes of the climate crisis and to give those countries most vulnerable a fighting chance to survive, we have to hold global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. They also told us in 2018 that we have just about 10%, or sorry, 9% of the global budget, carbon budget, to hold to 1.5 degrees of warming left in our kind of bucket of budget. And that's about 10 years at current levels of emissions. So we are very quickly set to surpass the remaining carbon budget for the world. And of course, that means that every country in the world has a carbon budget of its own. And Canada is quickly contributing to the emissions that are filling up the small amount of remaining room. Unfortunately, when it comes to the history of Canada's action on climate change, we've really never met a target we couldn't miss. So we've been setting climate targets since the early 1990s, starting in 1992 in Rio, and we've missed every single one that we've set. So we missed that Rio target, we missed our Kyoto target for 2012, and indeed, as you all will know, we, as a country, removed ourselves from the Kyoto Protocol altogether. We set a target in 2009 at Copenhagen for 2020 this year, and we are well above what that target is right now. What does this mean for our Paris Pledge, our 2030 emissions reduction target? Well, here's a graph that makes that plain for us. So if you take a look at that red line, that was the reference case of modeling of Canadian emissions out to 2030 in 2015. So when the government was thinking through the Pan-Canadian Framework on Climate Change and Clean Growth, this was where our modeling was telling us our emissions would be by 2030. With the initiatives proposed by the Pan-Canadian Framework, the PCF, plus much of the activities going on in the provinces and territories, the modeling shows us that the new modeling in 2019 shows us that we could be hitting this blue line if we're able to implement the most ambitious of policies. Then we're probably following something closer to this green line of emissions to 2030. And that little orange diamond at the bottom there is our 2030 emissions target. So currently, while there are federal policies in place and there are provincial and territorial policies in place, we are still off track to meet our 2030 emissions reduction target. And there is our Copenhagen target hanging out pretty far away from where our current emissions sit. Of course, the existing emissions reduction targets, so our current Paris Pledge, does not represent Canada's fair share of the global effort to address climate change. So we are off track to meet that target, and that target in and of itself is insufficient. Climate Action Network Canada, in partnership with our members and on behalf of our members, every few years we do a calculation of what Canada's fair share in light of science and equity is to that global contribution. And here's a quick take on what our most recent calculations of that fair share are in light of the 1.5 degree threshold. So we calculate that our domestic emissions reduction goal should be double of what it currently is if we're going to be doing our fair share, so 60% below 2005 levels by 2030. And we also calculate that given Canada's historical responsibility for climate change and our ability to act, we are one of the 10 wealthiest nations in the planet, that we should be doing quite a lot of work outside our domestic borders to help emissions reduce in other parts of the world. So this is just to communicate that we have our work cut out for us. We've made some progress in recent years, but we still have our work cut out for us to get on track to meet our current goals and to deliver on our fair share. At a certain point, if you keep missing climate targets, you probably have to ask yourself if there's something you need to change about the way you're doing climate action. And that's where our campaign on climate accountability comes in. So rather than simply pushing Canada to set new, more ambitious, higher emissions reductions targets, we at Climate Action Network Canada, in partnership with our members over the last few years, have been saying, hey, let's actually change the way we're doing things so that we never miss another target. And let's implement these legislative and institutional mechanisms that we're seeing implemented elsewhere in the world and that have been recommended in Canada for many years, as Tony was saying in the opening. Let's make those changes so that we are figuring out how to do climate action better. And that's what accountability is. It's ensuring that Canada delivers on its promises when made under the international spotlight, even when that spotlight turns elsewhere. And we see these three kind of components of accountability: answerability, so creating that obligation as strong as possible for Canada to articulate what it's going to do to meet its commitments and why those actions are being taken. Identifying responsibility that makes those commitments explicit and answers who's responsible for what. And finally, ensuring that there are consequences when we fail to meet our goals. And this, of course, sounds familiar, right? So we, in the last number of months, have seen what it really looks like when we respond to an emergency like it's an emergency. In the last few months, we have seen our governments listen to the experts, set out clear targets and goals with clear timelines, develop action plans and execute them, test, measure, and assess progress toward goals and targets, and recalibrate those action plans when new data is available and when it's clear that course corrections need to be made. This is what's been working in the midst of the COVID-19 crisis, and it is exactly the formula that would work and that we need to address the climate crisis. Because right now, what we're doing with climate change is we're setting faraway targets in 2030 and 2050, and we're not bringing these other components in. And that would be equivalent to saying we want net zero cases of COVID-19 in 2050, and then not doing anything in the near term to make sure that happens. The good news is that everyone's doing it. So if you take a look at this map, the jurisdictions in green are those jurisdictions that have already adopted or in the midst of adopting elements of climate accountability frameworks. The ones in blue are those jurisdictions that are currently considering climate accountability frameworks and developing them. So we see these unfolding in Norway, New Zealand, Germany, and the UK, which is really the kind of landmark example of climate accountability legislation. And right Here at home, we've got a Climate Change Accountability Act in British Columbia. We have elements of accountability legislation and institutional mechanisms in Manitoba, and Quebec is currently discussing its own climate accountability framework. I mentioned that UK Climate Change Act. It was passed in 2008, and it is really what has provided much of the model that other jurisdictions around the world are using to build their climate accountability frameworks out with. And of course, the UK Act has been a big part of what has been suggested Canada model its own Climate Accountability Act on for several years. So some really good pieces there. Including the fact that the UK set 5-year carbon budgets, and has met the first 3, has given itself time to do that course correction, that assessment, that data gathering. But the fact that this act exists not only allows us to take from its strengths, but it helps us to learn from its mistakes. So I think really helpful to have such a solid model that's been in place for so many years, so that we can, take what worked from it and learn what didn't work from it. And now Julia is going to take us through the bulk of our own recommendations.
Thanks so much, Kat. Before I get started, just to mention that I'm joining you from Toronto, the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas, the Credit, the Anishinaabe, and Wendat peoples. And like Kat, I'm going to turn off my video so you can just focus on the slides here. Bear with me. Okay. So broken out what we're proposing to you, proposing for government to pass as climate accountability legislation, there's really 3 cornerstones. The first cornerstone is clearly set goals, or clearly identifying the challenge we need to address, both with respect to mitigation and adaptation. So more specifically, the legislation we recommend would set some specific goals. It would also, more importantly, require the government to continually reassess those goals and set new ones down the road. The second key cornerstone of climate accountability legislation would be an iterative process for the delivery of plans to address those goals and challenges, the delivery of reports on both actual emissions and progress towards delivering on the plans, and the delivery of answers, a kind of conversation between the government, independent experts, Parliament, and the public on all of the above. Lastly, speaking of experts, the last key cornerstone would be a system of independent expert oversight, an arm's-length expert committee that would provide advice and report on progress. In our report, we use 5 pillars to break out the key components of legislation, and I'll be taking you through each of these pillars in turn. 1 through 3 roughly tracks with what I called the first cornerstone. 4th is the second, the planning and reporting, and lastly, the arm's length expert committee. So pillar 1, the long-term targets. These target setting provisions in legislation would be most straightforward in many ways and really are the lodestar. They set the legislation would set the net zero target that the government has made its commitment to for 2050 and should also set a more ambitious 2030 target. Both of these would be set in law using directives like shall, or it is the duty of, to assign the clearest possible duty on the responsible ministers to achieve those targets. The question of duties and the responsibility, as Kat mentioned, are really important. So who should the responsible minister or ministers be? A principal way of thinking about who they should be is to think about what they need to achieve. And
Julia, it looks like you've muted your microphone. If you could just unmute.
There we go. Can you hear me again?
Yep, we can hear you perfectly.
Okay, that seemed to have done that by itself. I'll keep an eye on it as I go. Thanks. So maybe just starting from the responsibility, top of the responsibility. As Kat mentioned, responsibility is key when we're delivering accountability. So we asked the question in our advice, who should the responsible minister or ministers be? And we point out some key attributes that they need to deliver. They need to be able to facilitate intergovernmental coordination. They need to be able to align financial budgets with carbon budgets. They need to engage the high emitting sectors. And relatedly, they need to facilitate intergovernmental coordination across these key departments so that efforts don't get siloed. Turning to the next pillar, these are the 5-year carbon budgets, sometimes also referred to as emissions milestones. We need to break those long-term goals down and set medium-term goals. Carbon budgets, like household budgets, break down how much in the way of greenhouse gas emissions we can spend on the path to net zero. And this is as important, if not more so, than the specific 2050 target. As Kat mentioned at the start of the presentation, showing you the remaining global carbon budget, Canada needs to stay within its fair share of that budget on its way to net zero. The bar chart here on the side of the slide shows how the UK broke down its first few carbon budgets on its pathway to planning to reach its actual former 80% below 1990 levels goal. Its current goal is now net zero. It's just revised that in the last year. We propose using the same approach, national 5-year carbon budgets, which will cap the total volume of emissions over that 5-year period. Why 5 years? Well, based on international examples, as Kat mentioned, we have this wealth to draw from. 5 years provides a good balance between predictability and flexibility. We also recommend that the legislation require each budget for a budget period to be set at least 10 years in advance. So the carbon budget for 2032 to 2034 would have to be set no later than 2022. This gives us lots of lead time to plan, act on those plans, see how those actions are playing out, and course correct as necessary. So this picture thus far has been pretty similar to international best practice, closely modeled on the legislation which is passed in the UK and more recently in New Zealand. But Canada has some unique features. For one, we're a federal system, and the power to act on climate change is a matter of overlapping federal and provincial jurisdiction. We also have significant regional disparity in emissions. And the result of this combination of attributes is and has been an ongoing conversation about how to share the burden of reducing our GHG emissions across the provinces and territories. At the beginning, Kat outlined those key elements of a robust accountability system. So we have to be explicit, who is responsible for what. We have to make those responsible answerable for their actions and decisions. And we have to attach consequences for failing to live up to commitments. Taking all of that, our coalition's opinion is that the most robust and effective way to deliver Canadian climate accountability would include subnational carbon budgets. What's a subnational carbon budget? These would split each national 5-year carbon budget equitably and efficiency on the basis of technical input from the experts and more general consultations with Canadians about equity and fairness. Each budget would set the maximum emissions from within the geographic boundaries of the province or territory. It's not about who can do what. Rather, all the emissions reductions that would originate from those geographic boundaries would involve action from all levels of government. The budgets are not binding on the provinces or territories themselves. They're informational, but the province or territory could certainly elect, ideally through their own accountability legislation, in the way that BC has done and others, to make that budget binding on itself. They would be binding on the federal government, requiring the responsible ministers to achieve the national carbon budget fairly and equitably. The next slide shows you a timeline of how all of this might unfold. The legislation wouldn't set the budgets themselves. Rather, it would set timelines, as I mentioned earlier. The responsible ministers shall set the carbon budget for the budget period 2034 to 2038 by 2024, for example. So that sets out those first two aspects of it. We started at the beginning with the cornerstones. We talked about being clear about setting goals or challenges. This is the third aspect of setting your goals or challenges out clearly. We need a clear picture of what Canada needs to do to adapt to climate change. We're already experiencing these impacts across the country, and they'll only be worsening with the passage of time. Our proposal is that the law would mandate regular reports every 5 years, setting out the risks climate change poses to Canada. The expert committee would provide advice on these reports, as it does on the carbon budgets. The next pillar, Pillar 4, is an iterative system of planning, acting, and reporting on the results of those actions, then readjusting your plan, acting, and so on. The government will be required to table a plan on how it will meet each carbon budget, say within a year of setting that carbon budget. It would similarly have to table a plan on how we will adapt to the impacts of climate change, again, say within a year of each impact report. This would be the adaptation plan. The expert committee would issue reports on progress as the government does itself, and the government would have to respond to the experts' reports. This is this conversation that I mentioned, particularly where they're showing gaps between actions and results and the goals. The timeline on the next slide shows how this might play out. You set the budgets, you table a plan, you continue onward from there. Pillar 5 is the expert committee. This is only last because it's actually foundational in that it buttresses all of the preceding components. The committee would be made up of independent experts on climate change, clean tech, economics, a representation of regional and Indigenous perspectives, and would provide advice on the targets, on the carbon budgets and the impact reports, and also provide advice on the plans. On top of providing advice, it must, independent of government, monitor and report on progress. The next slide gives you a sense of how the expert committee's inputs would feed into the accountability system. It would truly be intertwined and specific, so there would be time-bound moments where the expert committee would be tabling reports, providing advice. That report and advice would be received by government, factored into its work. So this gives you a sense of that order of operations. Each of these 5 pillars, as set out here today and in more detail in our reports, has a specific role to play in delivering a robust climate accountability framework. In our view, weaken any one or worse fail to include one of these pillars, and the system that results will be much, much less likely to actually deliver accountability and actually break our cycle of missed targets. So what are the next steps? COP25 is when the Canadian government announced to the world it would legislate net zero by 2050 and strengthen the 2030 target. While of course COP26 has been postponed, countries are still expected to submit preliminary NDCs this year. And we're very hopeful and believe that Canada's 2020 NDC should include accountability mechanisms along the lines of what we outlined here. And ideally, we'd like to see a bill delivering those recommendations as soon as possible. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much to you, Julia, to Catherine, and to Tony. Fabulous overview and a lot of complicated detail really to cover. And we have now a few questions coming in. The first one, I'm going to read it to you because Senator Galvez is back and forth between a call to Spain and this event. She would like to know whether Tony or anyone else could tell us how climate accountability connects with the clean recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic and the economic downturn caused by that. Anybody want to take that?
Yeah, I can start. It's Tony. And it's a good question. I think, and I'm sure that the others may have suggestions to weigh in on this, but just as a start, I think, attention in this moment is appropriately turning to the discussion of what a clean or resilient recovery looks like, and attention of certain parts of the government directed to what investments might look like, strategic investments to drive that type of recovery forward. But I'd suggest that should not and need not really take attention away from the commitments around legislated targets and the broader climate accountability framework that we're talking about here. And that's because, for me, if the government is going to strategically invest in a resilient recovery, for example, using that language, this accountability legislation is actually a way to assure Canadians that those investments being made maybe in the nearer term will actually lead to tangible emissions reductions over the long term. It provides a bit of a buttress or backstop or foundation, if you will, to connect what we will want to see in terms of financial accountability for those investments to the intent of those investments, which is ultimately to drive a clean economy that leads us to significant GHG reductions and ultimately to the net zero clean economy that we're after. So that's the way I'd approach that. I'm not sure if Kat and Julia have anything to add there.
I might just hop in. So I think Tony captured it well. From my perspective, climate action is ultimately action that builds resilience. And we're right now being so confronted with some of the vulnerabilities that exist in our economic and social systems. And so resilience is the watchword, and that is ultimately what most forms of climate protection are trying to build, and being able to actually provide consistency and resilience in the ways in which we are taking action on climate change, and to build that, all of those good lessons about what works when we're confronted with a crisis that we've learned in the last few months into our approach to the climate crisis. It just makes all the sense in the world from my perspective. So I would see accountability mechanisms, an accountability framework, as really one of the backbones of the recovery period for Canada.
Not much to add to those great answers, other than to say perhaps that it is a long-term process, of course, recovering and tracking what happens with funds, for example, and what comes of commitments made during this interim process. Our structure is one which really does do that tracking. It's set up to look towards long-term goals and has the regular reporting. You can build more into the reporting and planning requirements that we outline. In some international jurisdictions, they take a more broad approach, which is a sustainable development approach. We've focused in on climate-specific goals, adaptation and mitigation as being the main focus here. We also have in Canada the Federal Sustainable Development Act already, which covers some of those broader sustainable development issues. So all of which is to say that I really do see this dovetailing with and being important to supplement and strengthen the work that's done on stimulus and recovery.
Wonderful. Thanks for those answers. Senator Kuchar is up next with his question. Stan?
Thank you very much, Mary, and thank you very much to the panelists. Wonderful, wonderful. As you can see, I'm doing casual Friday today, bare feet and all. What have been the most common criticisms of this climate accountability framework approach that have occurred in Canada? That's the first part. And the second part of the question, and what has been your response to them? How have you addressed those criticisms?
Thanks, Senator. I'll get us started. I'm barefoot as well, just so you know. So yeah, that's an excellent question. Within the Canadian context, I would say the questions that we get most often are about the burden sharing between the feds and the provinces and territories, because that is, of course, the question in Canada when it comes to climate action, where the jurisdiction to take action on that issue is so shared, and where we have this very unique form of federalism that doesn't really exist elsewhere in the world. And so we don't have a model that we can kind of point to say this is how they did it. So we have to create our own. The way we've suggested we have that conversation about burden sharing in Canada is through the development of these subnational carbon budgets. And the reason we've made that suggestion is because we don't have an explicit conversation about burden sharing on climate in Canada. Where those conversations come up most often is when provinces are, being asked to take action on climate change, and they're taking a look at what they've done over the recent years, and they're saying, oh, we've done enough. we've done it all already. Why don't you ask that province over there to do their fair share? And then, of course, the province over there says, oh, we've done enough too. So it becomes a very political conversation. And we're not naive. We don't think we're going to be able to take all the politics out of the conversation. But we do think we need to figure out how to institutionalize that conversation about burden sharing in some way. We need to kind of create a home for it that has rules, that has consistency, and that has an idea of equitable burden sharing kind of built right into it. So that's why we've made the recommendations we've made around subnational carbon budgets. I think all of us who are thinking about, so there was a report released this week by the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices on accountability frameworks as well. We agree a lot on most of the points. They've taken a different tack, but they also have identified that we need to figure out how to have that burden sharing conversation in Canada. So that's the big question. Internationally, I think one of the main criticisms of the UK Act on accountability was its failure to include adaptation, was its failure to include that focus on resilience, which is why we've really built that into our recommendations for Canada. Julia or Tony, I don't know if you want to hop in on that.
Yeah, I might just add a little bit on the first point about burden sharing that Kat was making, and it's just to kind of reinforce that as Julia described in our presentation, that what we're proposing in terms of legislation is actually to set up a framework, right? And it's the intent is to not be overly prescriptive on that question of burden sharing, as Kat has said, but really to set up a framework to have the conversations, to institutionalize the governance that is needed to have an ongoing dialogue around equitably sharing the work that it will take across the economy, across the country, to get us to the net zero target that we're aiming at.
The only point I would add about our specific subnational carbon budget recommendation is, as Kat said, we include it because we want to institutionalize the discussion that's happening already. We include it at that specific carbon budget level because the carbon budget, as we mentioned, is a much more tangible target, a medium-term target. So, for example, it might sound something along the lines of the government will not exceed a carbon budget of 3,000 megatons between the years 2026 and 2030. And so then when you start to have a conversation about subnational contributions, like the work all Canadians do together to stay within those limits, it's really concrete because we're talking about a number. And when we talk about our burdens, our shares in relation to these net zero, which is in and of itself a bit of a vague concept, it's much harder to have a productive conversation. It's quite vague. And that's why we try and make it as concrete and tangible as possible.
Thank you for that. Could I just have a very brief supplementary, Mary?
You go right ahead.
Oh, thank you a lot. What would be the carrot that would encourage the various components of our federation to actually burden share?
As Kat mentioned, one of the things that we tried to do differently from some of the other jurisdictions we looked at was really build in the conversation about adaptation. We're all working together to achieve a safe climate, to address the risks to all Canadians. That slide showed you the disparate impacts across the country. Bringing that all in, and we also mentioned just transition. We think that those principles should be built in and explicit in this framework. So it is building in that cross-cutting conversation, and it's happening all in one place. Frankly, the money should be spent in ways to assist the areas of the country that need to reduce the most. And that can all be done if you're doing it in this systemic way that we're proposing, having those, like make your plan. 1 year later, you set your budget. 1 year later, you have your plan. And remember the timeline. You can go back and look at that again. We suggest the timing of the impact reports to really feed into that. So it's all connected. Then your conversation is a lot more fruitful. These are the trade-offs that are happening. We have to address this. This is the impact that's going to be felt. Let's bring in the money here and have it all in one place.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and thank you, Senator Kutcher. So we have both Senator Deacons with questions. Marty, I don't know if you want me to ask it, or are you able to ask the question yourself, Senator Marty Deacon? I know she's between meetings, so I'll ask her question then. She wanted to know what other countries are doing that we are not doing, that you would point to. And you've already spoken somewhat to that, but there may be something additional on the international.
Thank you, Mary, very, very much. And the point being was sort of a follow-up or a part B to Senator Kutcher's question on, you know, what we have or haven't been doing, and even maybe some of the best practices from other countries that we should be considering. Thank you.
Here. Yeah, we've actually done a really comprehensive chart on international best practices, and we'd be happy to share that with anyone interested. It's actually available online, so there's a link we can share. Tony may be able to even put that in the chat quickly. I'm not sure. I'm putting him on the spot there. And I can do it as soon as I finish answering your question. So I would say that in terms of, I mean, a lot of other countries have had these frameworks in place already. They've been working away and they've got them kind of on this track. The UK, most notably, for more than 10 years now. They passed their legislation in 2008. What is different about you know, some of the distinctions between what we propose? Some legislation, for example, includes sectoral targets. We don't propose that. There are some, we think there's a place for sectoral targets. So taking a sectoral approach to reducing, and that can certainly be built or layered in. Other countries make that the focus. The feedback we got in our various consultations was that you run into danger of siloing your efforts. We talked at the beginning about making sure that those different departments are talking to each other, are collaborating. The danger of sectoral targets is that people put their blinders on. They look in to their department and they're thinking just about how they achieve their sectoral targets. They're less engaged in it as a whole of economy problem, and we wanted to make that very explicit and clear. So I would say those are a couple of examples, but yeah, we'll share as well the link for you, which shows that whole spectrum of different approaches. Kat may have something to add as well.
Oh, great. You were able to include that brief. So I might also direct you towards some case studies on other jurisdictions that have employed accountability frameworks that the CICC, the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices, released along with their report on Canadian climate accountability. There's some really interesting information in there as well that can complement this table that Julia has talked about that we pulled together. So I think Julia's right. And the one thing I would add that I see happening in other jurisdictions that we're not quite having a conversation about here is the kind of macroeconomic elements of climate action. So we see in the EU, for instance, there are some interesting approaches that they've used to encourage climate accountability in member states. And then at the kind of EU Parliament level, they've produced a taxonomy on kind of green investments that helps to complement some of those pieces of accountability so that you're actually achieving that kind of macroeconomic transition toward a greener economy while also stepping up on your climate goals.
Mary, just one quick comment, if I could. One of the things I've also been wondering about with this is if our accountability framework, and that's where I've been reflecting on, is actually flawed. Those frameworks themselves are actually interesting to compare also. So thank you so much.
Thank you, and thank you for those answers, and also for sending us the table in the chat. We'll make sure that we get that out with the report that comes out of this conversation, so that all senators and Senate staff get it, not just those who are in on the chat. We like to make sure everybody gets everything. So we have a question from Senator Colin Deacon. Colin?
Thanks, Mary. I'm sorry, I was a little late to joining the call and I apologize. What I'm wondering about is agriculture in particular, us having more of a system approach to carbon in agriculture. Right now, we look at carbon production, but we don't look at the sequestration opportunities in agriculture, and we don't reward the carbon sequestration opportunities in agriculture. And so best practices often are not implemented in any country. They are in Canada, but they're not rewarded in some sectors. And I'm just wondering about how your framework works with rewarding individuals, making sure that individuals are rewarded for what they are doing within the whole system that they're operating as a business or as an entity, not just our economy as an entity. Thanks.
The framework that we're proposing is probably one stage higher level and doesn't engage head on with that, the sort of sector specific point. But I think the same mechanisms that we suggest can get unfolded within departmental approaches. And it would probably naturally flow too, because again, this is going into more of how you operationalize this legislation, and it gets into the how departments work, and each department is different. But because they'd be required to feed out into an accountability system that is really talking about progress that you've made, how you've improved, how you're tracking towards those goals, it would be much easier to capture those successes and make sure that they are remarked, noted, as you say, rewarded in some way, in that there's recognition of that success. We would also expect that the experts in their assessment, when they are providing that advice, speak quite granularly to that kind of opportunity. And so that in the planning process, they're waking up government to, government has a sense of this stuff already, but in the planning process, and you're thinking about allocation of funds and how best to support those next steps that need to happen, you can really get in on that. So again, it is by being systemic and thinking about what you need to achieve, and then showing how people are in fact achieving, you have a much better way of getting at what is happening on the granular level too.
Yeah, and maybe I'll hop in and just make the comment that it's true that our recommendations around accountability are higher level. And where we're getting more into the weeds, and by we I mean Climate Action Network Canada in this instance, is in our recommendations for Canada's nationally determined contribution to the Paris Agreement, or NDC. So I think Julia was the one who mentioned that 2020 would have been the year that Canada, along with all other parties to the Paris Agreement, were expected to come back to the table with revised NDCs. And we're not quite sure what the timeline for that revision now looks like for Canada, although we are expecting something to come in the next 6 to 8 months. And it's really in that element of the plan that you start to get more into the sectors, right? So in the Pan-Canadian Framework on Climate Change and Clean Growth, there wasn't a whole lot of detail in agriculture. And in the recommendations that we are making CanRac to the government on what a new NDC should look like, we've said, you need to kind of get more into the detail of what the agricultural sector has to contribute to Canada's action on climate change, and how you can incentivize that contribution.
Thanks very much. I just want to make sure that I understand that there is a positive as well as a negative side to this. You're really looking at net and then the evaluation of how our policies are causing that net to occur across the country. And that sounds what I thought I heard that, but I wanted to make sure I heard that. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes, that's absolutely the case. Yeah, that's actually like a huge part of the point of trying to pull this together, because currently we're not doing that very well, that having that equitable balance.
Okay, thank you. And thanks for the question, Colin. Senator Galvez had another question, and then there's another follow-up. So Senator Galvez, you've answered a little bit her second question, but it's really about the role that senators can play. We've talked about this issue of the conversation that needs to happen on that burden sharing and that interjurisdictional, federal, provincial. Any ideas you might have? I mean, really, we need to ask ourselves as well, but that you might think of that senators can play in that.
Yeah, I mean, thanks for the question. I think it's an important one, and in part, I think maybe the answer turns the cameras back on you all as senators a little, because you know your role better than we do. But from my perspective, I think there is a role that senators can play as, the more traditional kind of regional balancing representation part of the role. Also, the evolution of the Senate to representation around not just regions, but other kind of groups in Canada, to really, be speaking out around these issues and the opportunities that legislation like this presents to kind of bring that conversation around equity and equitable sharing of the work. I try to stay away from the word burden, because I think it's the work that we need to do across the country to really get at a collective approach to dealing with and delivering on the climate actions that we need to get to a net zero target, which is ultimately what we're on the track to committing to. So for me, is engagement in your regions with provincial or territorial governments, municipal governments, to understand what they're doing, First Nations in their territories, Indigenous groups in their territories and lands. I really think that there's a role that can be played to help socialize the ideas and to help recognize that this is, a conversation and an issue that needs to really cut across the entire economy, and everybody needs to kind of equitably play their role in doing their part.
Thanks, Tony. Anybody else, Kat or Julia, want to jump in on that? Or
no, I think Tony answered that beautifully. I just wanted to add one more point for Senator Deakin, that if he's interested, there is a section in our detailed report about the net carbon account, where we very explicitly include recommendations about what goes in and what goes out and what you need to do to assess that. And that a fair amount of work goes into defining that idea, and that all of the targets and goals are set in relation to a net account. So just in case he really wanted to get into the weeds on that one.
There's one more question here. I just want to make sure we get it in. So COVID has provided the sense of urgency because of the frequency daily updates that we're getting. How can a yearly climate change report attain such a goal, that sense of urgency?
I might take a stab. So if you think about the way you get information on climate, I mean, maybe not you personally, because as senators, you're going to be in the know more so than the average Canadian. So if we think about how the average Canadian hears about climate change in Canada, generally about once a year, generally around the time of the UN climate negotiations, Canadians hear that another round of UN climate negotiations are going on, and they hear that Canada has a long-term goal to reduce emissions by 30% below 2005 levels by 2030. And that's about it. So in that context, as the average Canadian, if all you're hearing about is a bunch of countries getting together, including Canada, and you're hearing also on the news that there are a lot of people in the streets who are really riled up about climate change, who are asking governments to do more, but all you're hearing about what your government is doing is a long ways away emissions reduction goal that's in percentage numbers, then you don't have a very good sense of what it is that's actually happening on the ground in your country when it comes to climate action, how that long-term goal is being achieved, what climate change means for you and your community, what kinds of impacts you're facing, and whether or not those can be tied to climate change, what your government's doing to help you and your community adapt and build resilience against those impacts. And ultimately, you're going to feel really disconnected. You're going to not really have a good sense of what it is that you can contribute or how climate action is changing your community. So you might be seeing, lower emissions buses on your street, but you're not understanding that that's actually part of a plan, an overall plan that your country and your province and your municipality are undertaking together in order to address the issue of climate change. And so the reporting schedule that we recommended, and again, there's way more detail on this in the reports, does try to bring all of those elements together. So says, this is what the impacts look like. This is what we need to be doing to address those impacts. And also lays out a series of indicators that help to make climate action more tangible. So rather than it always being about that long-term emissions reduction target number, we can say we are going to, in order to meet our goals, try to reduce the number of single passenger vehicle trips taken in internal combustion engine vehicles by 20% over the next 5 years. And then you can track that over time and provide regular updates on whether Canada is meeting that kind of tangible goal and what the various policies that are going into helping us meet that goal are. So investments in public transportation, investments in electric and low emissions vehicles, land use changes, investments in active transportation. So they're all adding up together. And I think, it's not a panacea and not everyone's always going to read those reports, but what other jurisdictions have seen, so what the UK has seen, for instance, is that providing that kind of information regularly to the public, having an expert body that is credible and trusted and is able to enter into that conversation in a less political way because they're not elected officials, has really helped to nurture and enrich the conversation around climate action in those jurisdictions. And it's helped to make the citizens of those jurisdictions feel more like they know what's going on and feel more like this is something that their country is taking very seriously, and therefore it's something that makes sense for them to take seriously. So I think that, I hope that it helps to answer the question.
That helps a lot. Thank you so much, Catherine. And connecting those dots, having those shorter term objectives, that people know about, and then connecting what's actually happening to meeting those shorter term targets. So that's extremely helpful. And we could go on for hours, I'm sure, but we've said we would be together for 1 hour, and we're coming up to the close of the hour now. I just want to really sincerely thank the three of you for being with us today. And we know we'll be seeing more of you and hearing more from you. And now all of our colleagues, many know about you, but now they see you and know you better and know the kind of resources that you can provide us as we try to fulfill our roles as senators, as governors of this country, this trust that we have been given. And this issue is not going to go away. It is the defining issue of our lifetime, of our century. And I just really appreciate the work that you're doing and how you've been able to share that with us here today. We're going to continue these conversations in ways that are creative, like this. Senate, as you know, is not sitting regularly right now, and so our inquiry that we launched in February has been truncated. But we're hoping that many of my colleagues, including those on the webinar today, will pick up the ball when we get back and contribute to that inquiry. And wouldn't it be great if we meet, if we are the most spoken to inquiry in the history of the Senate? I think it's a goal we should look forward to, and also look at the other roles we can play as senators in our democracy at the different levels. So thank you for your advice, and thank you for your inputs, and thank you to my colleagues for being here. Have a wonderful Friday and a wonderful weekend.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for organizing, Senator, and great to be with you today, the senators.
It's our delight. Thank you.
Thank you.